Okay, I need you to stop whatever you are doing right now and look at two lists with me. Because these two lists side by side are going to tell you something that no press conference, no cable news anchor, and no official statement from Washington has been willing to say clearly. List number one, what Iran walked away from Bürgenstock, Switzerland with. Oil export sanctions, gone. Maritime blockade, lifted. Frozen assets in Qatar, released. A reconstruction fund with figures reported between $200 and $300 billion launched. And 440 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% still sitting untouched inside Iranian territory. Not inspected, not diluted, not discussed, not even mentioned as a precondition. Now list number two, what America walked away with. A calendar appointment. 60 days from now, the two sides will meet and begin discussing the thing America went to war over. That is it. That is the entire return on 4 months of military operations, 3 carrier strike groups deployed, billions of dollars in munitions expended, oil at $126 a barrel, and a global economy pushed to the edge of recession. A calendar appointment. So then I want you to hold both of those lists in your mind at the same time. Because what happened in Switzerland on June 22nd, 2026 is not a diplomatic win. It is not encouraging progress. It is not a constructive day, which is what Al Jazeera called it. What happened in Switzerland is the moment a country that launched a war specifically to destroy Iran's nuclear program ended up committing to pay Iran $300 billion to keep that nuclear program intact for at least 60 more days. And the reason this happened, the reason it was almost structurally inevitable, given the decisions America made in the months before this deal, the reason it tells us something deeply uncomfortable about where the next 60 days are going, that reason has a name. And the name is 2,400 years old. The ancient Greeks, specifically the Athenians, were not just storytellers. They were engineers of human behavior. They documented with extraordinary precision the exact mechanical sequence by which great powers destroy themselves. And they gave that sequence 4 words: hubris, ate, nemesis, tysis. And I want to walk you through each of those words carefully, because if you understand what they actually mean, not the pop psychology version that gets thrown around carelessly, but the original Greek meaning, you will understand everything about what is happening right now in the Middle East in a way that newspaper headlines simply cannot give you. Sadham, hubris is not ordinary arrogance. Ordinary arrogance is just thinking you are better than you are. Hubris is something more specific and more dangerous. Hubris is the arrogance of a power that has come to believe it exists above consequence, above the laws of geography, above the laws of economics, above the laws of history. Hubris is when a civilization looks at the physical world and says, the rules that apply to everyone else simply do not apply to us. The second word is ate. And ate is what the Greeks believed the gods sent as punishment for hubris. Ate is not stupidity. Ate is a very specific kind of blindness. The inability to properly assess risk even when the warning signs are directly in front of you. The refusal to listen to people who are telling you something has gone wrong. The certainty, the absolute certainty, even in the face of mounting evidence, that you are still winning. The third word is nemesis. And this is the one most people get wrong. Nemesis is not your enemy defeating you. Nemesis is reality itself refusing to cooperate with your illusions anymore. Nemesis comes from geography, from economics, from the laws of physics, from the fundamental limits of logistics. Nemesis is the moment when the gap between what you believe about yourself and what is actually true becomes impossible to ignore. And the fourth word is thesis, the collapse, the reckoning, the bill coming due. Now, in 415 BC, Athens was the most powerful city-state in the Mediterranean world. The largest navy, the most sophisticated democracy, the wealthiest treasury. And they made a decision that the historian Thucydides spent his entire career trying to explain to future generations who he somehow knew would need the warning. They decided to send their entire military force, their entire fleet, to conquer the island of Sicily. Why? Not because Sicily was threatening them, not because Sicily was strategically necessary for their survival, because they were powerful enough to want things. And they had stopped asking the question that power makes you stop asking, which is, what happens if this goes wrong? Thucydides called this pleonexia, the lust for more, the compulsion to expand beyond what is rational or what is sustainable. And what actually happened? The entire fleet was destroyed. The entire expeditionary army was annihilated. 45,000 men gone. Athens never recovered. 9 years later, the war was lost entirely. The world's most sophisticated democracy, the civilization that gave us philosophy and democracy and the concept of rational governance, destroyed. And Thucydides wrote what I think is the most devastating single sentence in the history of political analysis. Athens was not destroyed by Sparta. Athens was destroyed by its own refusal to acknowledge its own limitations. Mite. And if you are thinking right now that this sounds familiar, you are paying attention. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched something called Operation Epic Fury. The stated objectives were precise and they were extraordinary. Destroy Iran's nuclear infrastructure. Eliminate its ballistic missile program. Trigger regime change. Achieve all of this in less than 24 hours. I want you to hear that again. Less than 24 hours. For a country of 87 million people, a country whose military has spent 20 years, literally 20 years, preparing for exactly this kind of attack. A country that had dispersed its military capability into thousands of small independent units, specifically so that no single strike could collapse the system. The architects of Operation Epic Fury did not ask the question Thucydides says you must always ask first. They did not ask, what happens when this goes wrong? That is hubris. That is Athens sailing to Sicily. And just like Athens, America was not fighting one war. America was fighting 3 wars at the same time. If you want to understand how a superpower gets to the point where it is paying its enemy $300 billion before a single nuclear centrifuge is even discussed, you need to understand the resource arithmetic of fighting 3 simultaneous wars. Front number 1, Iran. Direct military engagement, Operation Epic Fury, naval operations in the Persian Gulf, airstrikes, missiles. This is the war everyone is watching. Front number 2, China. This is a technology war, semiconductor export controls, the attempt to cut China off from the advanced chips it needs to modernize its military and its artificial intelligence development. Hundreds of billions of American dollars invested in this campaign. And as I will show you in a moment, it is not working the way the people who designed it planned. Front number 3, Russia. The ongoing effort to support Ukraine. The ongoing effort to prevent the consolidation of a Russia-China-Iran strategic axis that would fundamentally reorder global power. 3 fronts, 1 country, finite resources, finite ammunition, finite political will. And here is the number that tells you everything you need to know about the actual state of American military capacity right now. The acting Secretary of the Navy announced publicly that the United States was pausing a $14 billion weapons sale to Taiwan. pausing. Because the American military does not have enough munitions to fight in the Gulf and also supply Taiwan at the same time. The country that spends more on its military than the next 10 countries combined. The country with 11 carrier strike groups. The country with the most sophisticated weapons technology in human history. That country had to tell its most critical strategic partner in the Pacific, "We are sorry, we cannot send you weapons right now. We are running a bit short." This is hate. This is the blindness. A superpower so thoroughly convinced of its own infinite capacity that it committed to 3 separate military and strategic theaters without running the basic logistical calculation of whether it actually had enough ammunition to sustain all 3 of them simultaneously. Maj bachakte hain. And then the variables arrived. The ones nobody in Washington had planned for. Because nemesis never comes from where you expect it. That is the entire point of nemesis. It comes from reality. And in 2026, reality's first and most decisive correction came from a geography lesson, the Strait of Hormuz. Let me describe this to you physically, because the physical reality of this place is the most important fact in this entire story, and it is almost never described properly. At its narrowest point, the Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide. 21 miles. And through those 21 miles flows 20% of the world's entire oil and liquefied natural gas supply. Every single day. Not some percentage of it on a good day. 1/5 of all global energy. Japan needs it to function. South Korea needs it. Germany needs it. India needs it. China needs it. The global economy needs it. And Iran closed it. Now the United States has the most powerful navy in the history of human civilization. Aircraft carriers, destroyers, nuclear submarines. Enough firepower concentrated in the Persian Gulf to sink every vessel Iran has ever built twice over before lunch. But here is the problem that no amount of firepower actually solves. You cannot bomb open a strait that is being closed by a country willing to absorb the counterattack and keep firing back. Iran had missiles positioned on the coast, drones in the air, mines in the water. And here is the economic arithmetic that was slowly bleeding the American military operation every single day. Every time the United States shot down one of Iran's attack drones using a Patriot interceptor missile, Iran spent approximately $5,000. America spent $4 million. Every single exchange, Iran was winning economically in every single engagement. And this connects to something the American planners most catastrophically underestimated. Iran has spent decades developing what they call mosaic defense. The idea is conceptually simple, but the execution is brilliant. Instead of concentrating military capability in large bases and command centers that an adversary can destroy in a single strike, you disperse, you distribute. You push decision-making down to the lowest possible level. You create thousands of small, cheap, mobile, independent units that can operate without any central command. There is no center to destroy. There is no single target whose elimination collapses the system. It functions like a biological organism. You can kill individual parts of it indefinitely. But as long as the distributed system survives, the organism continues. When Operation Epic Fury tried to decapitate Iranian military leadership, the system adapted around the damage like tissue healing around a wound. It did not collapse, it restructured. Bye-bye. But Nemesis did not only come from Iranian military ingenuity. It came from 4 other directions that Washington had not planned for. The first was the Arab Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar. These are the countries that American foreign policy has treated as its natural regional partners for half a century. They said no. They refused to allow American forces to use their airspace or their military installations to conduct strikes against Iran. Not because they love Iran, but because they understood with complete clarity that the moment they opened their territory to American operations, they would immediately become Iran's next legitimate military targets. They made a rational calculation and they chose self-preservation. Variable number 2 was Russia and China acting in a role that Thucydides would recognize immediately. Athens did not lose the Peloponnesian War because Sparta was militarily superior. Athens lost when Persia decided to fund Sparta. Persia did not need to fight. Persia just needed to provide enough resources to keep Sparta in the field. In 2026, China and Russia played the Persian role with precision. China continued buying 80 to 90% of Iran's oil, openly and publicly defying American sanctions. China provided technology to help Iran evade export controls. Russia provided diplomatic cover at the United Nations Security Council, blocking every resolution that might have constrained Iran. Both countries gave Iran the oxygen to keep functioning. Variable number 3 was Europe. Germany's defense minister said publicly on television that the crisis in the Strait of Hormuz was caused by decisions in Washington, not decisions in Brussels. Trump had publicly criticized and humiliated the Italian Prime Minister, his closest European ally, along with Germany and France. Instead of rallying the alliance around a common position, the American president systematically destroyed the coalition he needed. And variable number 4 is the one I find most genuinely surprising and most historically significant. Pakistan and Qatar became the architects of the peace process. The United States has been the central mediator of Middle Eastern diplomacy since at least 1973, Camp David, Oslo, the Abraham Accords. Always America at the center of the table. And in Bürgenstock, on June 22, 2026, the agreement was structured by Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif and Qatari intermediaries. The joint statement came from Pakistan and Qatar. The roadmap was announced by Pakistan and Qatar. The United States signed on to an agenda set by countries it has historically treated as secondary players. This is nemesis, not from military defeat in a single dramatic engagement, from geography, from economics, from the refusal of allies to follow a leader who no longer commands the moral authority that makes leadership possible. And if you are finding this analysis useful right now, if this framework is helping you see something clearly that the headlines are missing, I want to ask you to do one thing. Subscribe to this channel and share this video with one person today. One person who you think deserves to understand what is actually happening rather than what they are being told is happening. Because the gap between those two things right now is significant and it matters. Now we arrive at the negotiating table. And I want to introduce you to the concept that I believe explains everything about what happened in that room in Switzerland. I am going to call it the front-loading trap. And once you see this mechanism clearly, you will never read a diplomatic agreement the same way again. Here is how arms control negotiation is supposed to work. The foundational principle is verify first, then reward. You demonstrate compliance, I verify your compliance, then I give you the economic benefits you want. This is the logic of trust building in any high-stakes agreement between adversaries. This was precisely the structure of the JCPOA, the 2015 nuclear deal. Iran had to dismantle centrifuges first, reduce its enriched uranium stockpile first, allow international inspectors into its facilities first, demonstrate verifiable compliance first. Then, and only then, did sanctions get lifted and frozen assets get released. Iran just reversed that entire logic, and the United States agreed to it. Lecce, here is what Iran receives from this agreement immediately, before any nuclear negotiation has even begun. Oil and petrochemical export sanctions waived. Maritime blockade lifted. Frozen assets in Qatar released. A major reconstruction and development fund launched. What does the United States receive in exchange? A roadmap. A commitment that 60 days from now, the technical teams will begin discussing Iran's nuclear program. And I want you to understand the specific legal mechanism buried inside this agreement that makes this arrangement essentially impossible to reverse. Because this is the part that major news organizations are almost entirely failing to explain. The agreement contains a clause stating that nuclear negotiations, the actual substantive talks about Iran's weapons program, which is the reason for this entire conflict, will only begin after the United States has first implemented every single economic concession. In other words, Iran embedded the sequencing into the legal text of the document itself. You cannot even begin discussing the nuclear question until you have already delivered every economic benefit Iran demanded. The nuclear conversation is legally conditioned on American compliance with Iranian economic demands. Iran gets paid before the work even starts. And structurally, from a pure game theory perspective, whoever acts second in a sequential agreement controls the entire game. Because whoever acts second can always wait and see whether the first party has fully and completely delivered before deciding whether to reciprocate. Iran acts second on the nuclear question. Iran already received its first mover benefits on the economic question. This is not diplomatic clumsiness. This is a strategy that Iran's negotiating team built with extraordinary precision, having spent years studying every leverage point that was surrendered in 2015 and constructing a new framework that does not repeat a single one of those mistakes. Now I want to do something I always push students to do because I think it produces better thinking. I want to give you the strongest possible argument for why what the United States agreed to in Switzerland might actually be the right decision. Because if I only show you one side of this analysis, I am not doing analysis. I am doing something else. So here is the Steelman case. 1. The United States ended an economically catastrophic situation without a prolonged ground war. Oil at $126 per barrel was not sustainable for the global economy or for the American economy. Every additional week, the strait stayed closed. The world was losing hundreds of billions of dollars in trade disruption. Recession was not a risk at that price level. It was a mathematical certainty. Ending it at whatever cost may have prevented something considerably worse. 2. The deconfliction cell for Lebanon created a direct communication channel between American and Iranian military officials designed specifically to prevent accidental escalation in a conflict zone where both countries have overlapping and competing interests. That is not nothing. 3. The 60-day framework gives the pragmatic factions inside Iran, and they exist, they are real. They are not powerful enough to control Iranian policy, but they exist. It gives them political cover to make additional concessions. And Iran, whose economy is stabilizing, has theoretically less internal pressure to be a spoiler in the broader regional picture. That is a real argument. A reasonable person can look at this deal and say, given the three-front exhaustion, given the economic pressure, given the ammunition constraints, given the failure of the Gulf states to cooperate, maybe this was the least bad option available. I want to be honest with you, it is not a stupid argument. But here is what the Steelman cannot account for. On day 61, the morning after the 60-day window expires, Iran will still be selling oil freely. Iran will still have access to its frozen assets. Iran's economy will have had 2 months to begin stabilizing. And Iran will still have 440 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium sitting untouched inside its territory. What leverage does the United States have on day 61? Every card America held before this agreement, the sanctions, the blockade, the asset freezes, every single one has been played and surrendered. Before a single enrichment centrifuge was discussed, before a single international inspector stepped inside a restricted facility, America gave away its entire hand before seeing Iran's cards. And then there is the non-interference clause. Both parties commit to not interfering in each other's internal affairs. This single sentence formally ends any American support for the idea of political change inside Iran. At the precise moment when the Iranian government is most economically vulnerable, most politically exposed, most dependent on external revenue, America has legally guaranteed them sovereignty from external pressure. And there's one more thing, and I think it might be the most revealing thing about the actual state of American power right now. While J.D. Vance and his team were working through the night in Switzerland trying to hold this agreement together, President Trump was posting threats on social media. The Iranian delegation walked out of the joint session. Not because of anything Iran's hardliners did, because the American president undermined his own negotiating team in real time from his phone. The left hand and right hand of American foreign policy are not coordinating, and Iran has understood this completely. They walked out of the room. They let Pakistan and Qatar absorb the pressure. They continued negotiating indirectly through the mediators in a format where they were always responding to Islamabad and Doha, never to Washington. Iran extracted additional concessions in that process, and they appeared throughout to be the reasonable party waiting patiently for American dysfunction to resolve itself. That is not chaos on Iran's side. That is choreography, extremely well-rehearsed choreography, performed by an institution that has spent 40 years under maximum pressure, learning with great precision exactly which levers actually move things and which levers are theater. So let me bring this all together and return one final time to Athens, because this is where the comparison becomes most uncomfortable. After the Sicilian expedition destroyed the Athenian fleet, Athens did not accept what had happened. They kept fighting. They tried to rebuild their navy. They executed their best generals for the failure. The democratic system that had been Athens' greatest structural advantage began to degenerate. Demagogues rose, factions formed, and Thucydides writes, with what I can only describe as surgical sadness, that Athens was ultimately not destroyed by Sparta's military superiority. Athens was destroyed by its refusal to acknowledge its own limitations and by the internal corruption that refusal produced. Now look at what the United States is doing in the hours immediately after this agreement. Even as the ink dries on the memorandum, Trump is posting that he will hit Iran very hard if they do not comply.
Senators are on television calling the ceasefire a disaster. Pentagon officials are circulating plans for American seizure of control over the Strait of Hormuz, with tolls charged to vessels. This is not a country that has processed the lesson of the last 4 months. This is a country that is still inside its ot, still blind, still operating on the assumption that enough threatening language and enough military posture will eventually produce Iranian compliance, even though every piece of evidence from the last 4 months points in exactly the opposite direction. Midero, let me give you the full picture in the clearest terms I can. America went to war to destroy Iran's nuclear program. America ended up committing to pay Iran somewhere between $200 and $300 billion to maintain that nuclear program for at least 60 more days. America went to war to preserve its dominant position as the organizing power of Middle Eastern diplomacy. America ended up watching Pakistan and Qatar take over as the actual architects of the agreement. America went to war to demonstrate the credibility of its military power and its alliance structures. America ended up freezing a $14 billion arms sale to Taiwan
because it ran out of ammunition. America went to war to prevent the consolidation of a Russia-China-Iran strategic axis. That axis has never been more consolidated, more economically coordinated, or more diplomatically aligned than it is today. This is the reckoning, not a sudden dramatic collapse, the slow, grinding, structural kind. The kind where the rules you believed you had written for the world are no longer being followed by the other players. And the cost of enforcing them has finally exceeded what you are willing to pay. And if you want to understand what comes next, if you want to genuinely track whether the next 60 days produces something real or produces something that merely looks real in press releases, here is what to watch. Watch Lebanon first. It is the single most fragile element of the entire agreement. If there is any significant Israeli military action in Lebanon in the next 72 hours that Iran can frame as a ceasefire violation, Iran has legal grounds under the agreement's own language to declare the memorandum broken before it has even formally begun. Watch the technical teams in Switzerland second. Iran left its senior technical delegation in Bürgenstock. If those teams make real progress on implementation language, it signals Iran is treating the 60-day window seriously. If those teams introduce new conditions, stall on definitions, or raise demands that were not in the original text, it signals Iran is using the technical talks to buy time while the economic benefits already secured continue to flow. And watch for the next social media post from the American president. I say this with complete analytical seriousness. The single greatest ongoing structural threat to this agreement is not Iran's Revolutionary Guard. It is not Russia. It is not any of Israel's internal political factions. It is the demonstrated pattern of the American president publicly undermining his own negotiating team in real time. Iran used this exact vulnerability today. They walked out. They forced America to rely on Qatari and Pakistani intermediaries to pull the talks back together. They extracted additional movement in that process. They will run this play again. Every single time the American president gives them the opportunity, they will run it. Because it works. Mohammed, I want to leave you with a question that Thucydides would ask if he were watching this from outside. Not as an advocate for any country, not as someone who wants America to fail or Iran to succeed, but as someone who spent his entire intellectual life trying to understand why great powers make the decisions they make, even when those decisions are leading them toward outcomes they would never consciously choose. Iran closed a strait 21 miles wide. And with those 21 miles, a country with a fraction of America's military budget forced the most powerful military in human history to reverse its negotiating position, surrender its sanctions leverage, release frozen assets, commit to a reconstruction fund reported at $300 billion, and agree to a 60-day process. All of this before a single nuclear centrifuge was even mentioned in the room. If Thucydides was sitting across from the architects of Operation Epic Fury right now, I think he would say something very simple. I wrote this book. I described this exact sequence. I gave every stage of it a name. I explained the mechanics of each transition with enough precision that it should have been recognizable before it happened. And you did not read it carefully enough. The strong do what they can, but wisdom determines what they should. And the question for the next 60 days, and honestly for the next decade of American foreign policy, is whether the United States has enough institutional wisdom remaining to understand the difference between those two things, and whether the people making these decisions will seek out that wisdom before the next set of consequences arrives. Because if history is any guide, and history on this particular pattern has been remarkably consistent across 2,500 years, the consequences do not wait for you to be ready for them. They arrive on their own schedule, and they are not interested in press releases. If this analysis gave you something genuinely useful today, something that helps you see the structure underneath the events rather than just the events themselves, then I want to ask you again to subscribe to this channel, to share this video, and to leave me a comment below telling me which part of this framework changed something in how you are reading what is happening. Because the conversation in the comments on this channel is one of the best parts of making these videos, and I genuinely read what you write there. I will see you in the next one.